Mysteries of the Outer Darkness, The Art of Dying, by Stanley E. Anderson. Chapter 1, Fishers of Men, Section, Artistic Temperament. The outer darkness is a dead end. Edwin Weir turned the phrase over in his mind as a possible reply to the Elsant from Cardinal Joseph Marin in The Outer Darkness. He sat at the bay window looking out over his garden and watched birds splashing about in the fountain and nesting in the wisteria. Darkening clouds overhead threatened much-needed rain. Suddenly, Edwin saw himself diving upward, swimming into and through the cloud layer to reveal an infinite and empty blueness above, at first bright and airy, then dimming to sapphire, deepening to stuffy indigo, with small sparks lighting up here and there until he saw before his eyes a horizon-to-horizon black dome in place of open skies. His brain unexpectedly inverted his perception of orientation to the image, converting the dome overhead into a deep bowl underneath laden to the brim with a star-filled sea. The bowl and the sea of stars began shrinking, drawing inward around his conscious presence. His physical body seemed to be nowhere in view. The stars dimmed until only a handful remained visible, while the bowl transformed into a nest from whose dirt-colored interior colorful worms decorated in hypnotic patterns squirmed up onto the surface. The stars expanded, first into speckled glowing bubbles, then each bulging on one end and narrowing on the other, and finally hardening into a clutch of ill-formed eggs laid by brood parasites, already overlong in incubation and beginning to crack open. Around the edge of the nest, a group of several steel fingers, curved and sharp as claws, grew up out of the rim. The individual bars were spaced randomly around the circle of the rim, and each one, as it grew, gradually arched up like longitude lines encircling a hollow globe. At periodic intervals, another group sprouted out of the rim, its bars growing in between existing earlier growing claws. The curving claws stopped growing just short of meeting together at the globe's zenith overhead. From the perspective of the nest's bowl below, the locus of their collective points formed a perfect circular opening above, with the distant ball of the earth centered in that circle like a bullseye on a dartboard. Meanwhile, shell fragments chipped away from the cracked eggs until, one by one, each egg split in twain to reveal a deformed, flightless hatchling within. The chicks, excepting the penultimate, emerged from half-shells only to wobble momentarily and topple helpless onto the nest's floor. The increasing number of claws growing up around the rim meant that the bowl would soon become fully enclosed around its circumference, a veritable cradled and imprisoning sphere in the outer darkness. The clutch of helpless beaks aimed up at the growing claws were operating frantically, opening and closing in eerie, vacuum-suppressed, silent protest, while penultimate peeper waddled over to the edge of the nest and struggled in desperation to violently squeeze his contorted body between two adjacent bars. A newly emerging claw growing steadily up from the nest's rim below threatened to skewer the chick stuck halfway between the bars in its seemingly futile escape attempt. Exhausted, he stopped the struggle in apparent defeat. But a sudden shock from the initial prick to his bottom by the sharp claw growing up from below tapped a last hidden reserve of determination and energy, popping penultimate peeper through the bars and over the edge of the nest to freedom. The last hatchling, lately emerging from its shell after penultimate peeper had already begun waddling away, picked itself up from the floor of the nest it had flopped down onto. Finale Featherhead gazed soberly at its struggling brother, at that point pinned between the bars. Witnessing the sudden burst of resolve from his unexpected prick below, and subsequent escape, Finale Featherhead, uncertain, momentarily considered also attempting an escape through the bars, but glancing back at the wriggling sibling chicks, weighed the balance, ended its indecision, and turned back to rejoin the clutch, choosing confinement and companionship with the distressed family of helpless hatchlings. But now their demeanor had changed during that moment of indecision. As Finale Featherhead entered into the midst of the gathering, they all, to a chick, seemed to have forgotten their anguished protest against the enclosing bars. Their beaks were still operating, frantically opening and closing as before, but now they jabbed down at the brightly decorated worms, delighting in the newly discovered feast. Edwin rolled his chair back from his desk by the bay window. The unexpected image Edwin's brain had just presented to him was disturbing. Where had it come from? But he knew instantly. The view of nesting birds in his small garden here on earth had pierced the clouds of his failed suppression of memory. The vision's invasion had recaptured, metaphorically, both the fierce mental and physical struggles he had endured to flee from, as well as the insistent, exotic tang of unearthly desire for returning to the outer darkness. The vision's implication was true enough. Edwin could see that penultimate peeper was obviously he. Considering final Feathered's choice again, he wondered aloud, how many souls out there regret their decision to stay, having relinquished forever their earth-crawler status? He had only narrowly escaped that same fate during his first visit into the outer darkness, and, upon his reintroduction to earth-crawler status, had L-blocked several memory ridges in his brain and avoided, if he could, reminders of certain events during that 3-year period. Finale Feathered's influence and ultimate last-minute change of mind not least. Nevertheless, the gray clouds covering the sky above him now, still rain-hesitant, poured down claustrophobic memories in place of the impending rain. The memory ridges were drenched with images of the enclosing yet beauty-infested nests that shuttered any sweeping view of stars from the inhabitants living within the 12 fabulous Earth-orbiting cities of the outer darkness. Edwin returned to studying the birds flitting and darting about in his garden in a feeble attempt at drawing his thoughts away from the outer darkness and back down to earth. The sparkling city stars overhead had been hidden from view these last few nights by local cloud cover in earth-crawler skies around his home and garden, and the pinnacle of the system, normally the brightest star on a clear night, and always perfectly stationary and straight overhead, was Sapphire City, from which, that morning, had emanated the ill-sent request by Cardinal Marin asking for Edwin's investigation into causes for canonization and murder in the outer darkness. The absence these last few nights of Sapphire City glittering overhead, along with the other 5 sparkling cities normally visible in the night sky at Edwin's location, had made it easier for him to try to direct his attention down toward the more humble delights of earth-crawler activities. But this sudden and unexpected vision declared victory, and his attempted diversion failed. Edwin had written extensively on the origins of the orbiting jeweled cities of the outer darkness in his introduction to a series of reviews about their art and architecture in the Art of Faith journal. Early on, Redefined had lifted resources skyward or maneuvered large masses of raw material from the asteroid belt into Earth orbit. They had, over decades, been fashioned into a dozen enormous hollow spheres, each with a circular opening on their Earth-facing sides like giant unblinking eyeballs with dilated irises glaring perpetually back at the planet. The nests, for that is how they appeared through telescopes from the ground, were perched nearly 3 Earth diameters away and spread every 30 degrees around the equator in 12 geostationary branches. Footnote. The speed of objects in geostationary orbit, at a distance of 22,236 miles above the equator, exactly matches the rotational speed of the Earth, so that they would, if visible from the ground, appear to be unmoving in the sky above. The nest's shells were fashioned of interwoven protective mesh with diameters the size of well-populated Earth-crawler cities, and designed to shield the jeweled cities housed within from harmful solar radiation. The iris-like opening itself was protected from the sun's dangerous radiation by the Earth's own intervening disk between the iris and the sun. Footnote. Secondary protection from a shell's iris opening from the slight angular direct line-of-sight radiation during the nest's daily orbital voyage around Mother Earth was contributed by the Earth's surrounding Van Allen belts. The result, as seen from Earth, was a glittering clutch of crystallized shells creating a jeweled necklace of cities encircling the globe. Earth-crawlers anywhere on the planet could gaze up into a clear night sky and see a perfectly formed semicircular arc always of the same, at least, 6 unmoving fiery lights from horizon to horizon, east and west, no matter the time of night or season. The remaining cities on the equator's far side were eternally hidden behind a viewer's horizons, while the steadiness of the visible flares declared a brazen and eerie prominence in their motionless affront against the slow, persistent parade of moon and stars and planets behind them. Footnote. Due to atmospheric refraction, adding 1/2 degree at each horizon, thus providing slightly more than 181 degrees of sky dome in all directions, a suitably positioned observer on the equator might just make out 7 of the jeweled cities, the 2 ends of the 7-beaded string hovering slightly above each of the opposite eastern and western horizons. Observers at higher latitudes might, under pristine conditions, be able to pluck more than 7 out of the intervening horizon, while an observer at one of the poles could, theoretically, see all 12 cities guarding the planet like sentinels stationed every 30 degrees along the edge of their circular horizon, like the 12 gates of the heavenly Jerusalem described in the Revelation of John. Each of the 12 nests sheltered a population of millions housed within the sphere's interior, a cloud of structures not spread out flat as cities on the surface of the earth, but interconnected balls of weightless mass, like a bulk of branches in a rootless tree, having no primary trunk growing up from any ground. Rather, groups of structures, or districts, would be contained within secondary and smaller transparent bubbles, or eggs as they were often called informally, containing atmosphere for the district's inhabitants, allowing them access throughout the district without the need to don protective suits against the vacuum of space. Many of the larger transparent eggs within a jeweled city's protective nest were also connected by transparent tubing for unprotected travel between district eggs, though some districts chose complete isolation from a city's main bulk of interconnection. For example, monasteries and convents that might desire controlled conditions away from unfettered public access for prayer and contemplative purposes. Ironically, though the nests eternally concealed any wide view of the great branching rivers of stars strewn across the backdrop of the cosmos from inhabitants inside the jeweled cities, they reflected the sun's light back toward Earth, at the same time refracting it into brilliant and gradually changing hues according to the varying incident angle onto the Earth below. Even the humblest space-fearing earth-crawler looking up into the sky from below saw, nightly, both a light show of colors from the glittering jewels of the orbiting cities, as well as the inspiring backdrop of those rivers of stars denied the brood within the enclosed cities above. And the steady glow of city lights within the nests emanating from the iris opening produced a bright central light seemingly surrounded by a colorful halo of the reflected sunlight, enhancing an earth-crawler's wonder. The Earth's, and therefore also the jeweled cities, 24-hour rotation period caused the angle and color of refracted light from the sun's reflection to range slowly over the course of several hours each day through the entire Roy G. Biv visible portion of the spectrum. Footnote. The faux name Roy G. Biv, R-O-Y-G-B-I-V, is an acronym for Sir Isaac Newton's arbitrarily designated 7 colors of the visible spectrum: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, that occur in that order. And because each of the 12 jeweled cities occupied a different location in the circle of the geosynchronous orbit around the Earth, that meant each city visible from a particular location on Earth would glitter with a different color, making for varied patterns of colored lights across the sky for Earth crawlers below. It was often a childlike word game pastime to search for anagrams of the letters in the Roy G. Biv color initials that might therefore form words across the sky at particular times as the colors changed hue through the night. Edwin was a student of history. If medieval cosmology considered the sun, moon, and planets as wanderers among the fixed but still stately marching stars of the primum mobile, these stationary stellae novae had surely been Empyrean incantations made manifest in the very sphere of fire below the moon's orbit. Now, arched across the heavens, they seemed to moderns, only a few generations earlier than Edwin's ilk, to herald an equally glorious era of profitable space exploration. Edwin mused with his readers over the irony, citing countless overconfident pronouncements in past ages that had touted the benefits of some novel-sounding social or economic or scientific development, with radical changes passionately predicted to make the endeavor worth it all, predictions that never fully materialized and faded into obscurity, or, more likely, ushered in mass sufferings and social upheavals that couldn't have been intentionally engineered more efficiently. In step with those past faded predictions, the jeweled city's promise of profitable space exploration eventually seemed to evaporate into the vacuum of the outer darkness. For like Simon Peter in a boat on the lake of Gennesaret at night, Redefined had toiled deep into the outer darkness but taken nothing. Aside from a few luxury trifles, there were scientific advancements for lifting more cargo into space cheaply, token expeditions to the inner planets and asteroids, and medical treatments for health problems associated primarily with prolonged weightlessness. But these technologies did little to help real masses of people living back on the surface of the Earth. Any spin-offs that did help might have been developed far more cheaply by a direct assault at solving particular problems. Redefined kept the orbiting cities functional, apparently due more to economic inertia than for any pressing space exploratory reasons. The automated control systems in the cities required few, highly specialized personnel to supervise the equipment, and so the cities attracted populations of largely non-technical inhabitants. Not that many would find continual indoor confinement appealing, nor willingly submit their bodies to the gradual deterioration that weightlessness imposed. The corrosive effects on weightless residents of the orbiting cities, WROC, or space rocks, as they were disparagingly called on Earth, eventually made their off-Earth status permanent by physical necessity. Edwin himself had finally, after a 3-year residence, escaped from the nests, if only by a determined and forceful act of will. He shuddered at the memory of the trauma he had endured in reconditioning his body to accept once more the constraints obliged by earth-crawler gravity. And he would not now, if he could help it, let himself be drawn back to be found among their nesting numbers again. Nevertheless, certain opposite extreme personality types were attracted to the orbiting cities by psychological effects that were enhanced, redefined, claimed, by the influence of zero gravity. Edwin was aware of his own susceptibility to one of those extremes, and its draw on him induced a Newtonian third law-like equal and opposite reaction upon his current desire to stay put on Earth. For one of the extreme effects produced a sense of heightened perception and clarity of thought. Scholars engaged in deeply abstract subjects along with religious contemplatives pursuing prolonged meditation and prayer were drawn by the lure, content merely to elsent personal or intimate thoughts with individual earth-crawler friends, absent actual physical contact. Introverts, who made up a sizable portion of this sort, were thus happily able to avoid fussy and distracting physical interactions and time-consuming travel between the opposing cosmic faces of planet and orbiting nest. Such travel was severely constrained, if not impossible anyway, at least for hardened space rocks whose physiological deterioration had rendered that option moot. But even the virtual and visually effortless elsent might only rarely be exercised in any case. Personal communications between the vacuum chasm-divided populations of Earth and the jeweled cities were typically strained, as Edwin himself had experienced that very morning with Cardinal Marin's elsent request from the outer darkness. One economic benefit of the purported heightened perception and clarity of thought was its enticement for streams of the faithful, of whom Edwin had been part, to make year-long pilgrimages to the fabled and majestically styled churches in the orbiting cities, a dozen places of worship in the outer darkness. Each of the 12 cities was designed with a unique cultural and aesthetic influence based on one of the 7 continents, or 5, by now well-populated, oceans of the earth, and each city's name was patterned after a gem from the foundations of the 12 towered walls in the New Jerusalem described in the Revelation of John. Starting from the assumed cradle of humanity and working westward around the geostationary circle, the 12 cities' names took in turn the 12 continents and oceans: Jacinth Township for Africa, Amethyst for the Atlantic Ocean, Sardonyx City for South America, Chrysolite City for North America, Chalcedony Colony for Antarctica, Beryl Key for the Southern Ocean, Emerald Sea for the Pacific Ocean, Sardius for the Arctic Ocean, Jasper Outback for Australia, Chrysoprasia for Asia, Topaz Village for the Indian Ocean, and finally Sapphire City for Europe. Unencumbered with the structural necessities imposed by gravity, these orbiting churches of the outer archdiocese, as the sea was called by the church, were undisputed wonders of the modern world. Holy Crown Cathedral was the central structure in Sapphire City, first among equals, of the jeweled cities, and shared that city's European continental influence in its design. Straddling a longitude between Rome and Jerusalem, Holy Crown Cathedral was indeed the crown jewel of the system. Looking down eternally from its geostationary perch upon both the chair of St. Peter and the Holy Land whereupon had walked the Vicars of Christ and the King of Kings himself, it was often the climactic ending for a typical year-long pilgrimage composed of a month's vigil at each of the central churches in the 12 nests around the heavenly circle. Little wonder that many erstwhile visitors decided at that point to call this refuge in the outer darkness home permanently. Edwin recalled with regret and clenched teeth his own enthralled decision back then to embrace a gravity-free lifestyle for that very reason. The other and opposite psychological extreme drawing earth-crawlers to the jeweled cities was dominated by darker disorientation and lightheadedness. This weightless-induced confusion of mind, again so claimed redefined, when enhanced by mood-altering drugs or simple intoxication, could produce an almost irresistibly attractive high for obsessive personalities. The resulting rash of treatments for near madness and investigations of otherwise wildly improbable crime spree cases provoked an oral parody of the Church's designation Outer Archdiocese that morphed into the cynical name Outer Darkness Disease. Section: Minimalism. Cardinal Joseph Marin had come early to the confessional cell of Holy Crown Cathedral in Sapphire City to prepare and pray for hearing confessions. No one was there, but the oval door on the confessional was ajar. He grumbled uncharitably, mentally accusing the last priest of having left it unlocked after his confessions. He realized it must have been Father Farbus, but when the cardinal opened the confessional door, he saw the priest's face, chalk white, slightly turned left, eyes open and staring blankly. The hips were tilted, and one side of the priest's torn open alb was wound up, wadded and tied like a rope, wrapped around his waist, the rest of the cloth draping away from the torso. The body's chest was bare, and at its first sight the cardinal caught his breath. The pale face of death was not the primary cause of the cardinal's audible gasp. The arms were missing. Cardinal Joseph closed his eyes for a moment, making the sign of the cross. The dead priest's left arm seemed to have been ripped out of its socket at the shoulder, and the right arm appeared to have been sliced off a few inches below the shoulder joint to make a stump like a neatly pruned tree branch. A laser knife might have been used, Cardinal Marin thought, to sever the arm so cleanly. However it was done, the murderer obviously intended the body's pose to be a vile mockery of the Venus de Milo statue. Cardinal Joseph's Elsent to Edwin, looking out upon his garden on earth later, gave no details of further investigation by the Sapphire City police, but the cardinal did recount one additional aspect of his discovery of the body. The cardinal's nearly exclusive use of oral, though potentially less private than quell whenever he Elsent anyone, was also less tonally muted than the more sterile quell, which meant that his very pauses and their implied tone conveyed emotion and context in a manner far more expressive than the touted complete privacy of quell could ever hope to achieve. Footnote: the terms quell and oral are subcategories of the more general mental communication term Elsent, and are used when their quantum wave function properties, as in quell, or lack thereof, as in the more analog subcategory oral, are pertinent. The associated terms delsent and relsent denote mental deactivation and reactivation of Elsent, respectively. Edwin could almost see in his head the image of the cardinal looking down at his own trembling hands, pausing for breath, and even a light swiping sound of his right hand on his forehead, chest, and shoulders, behind whispered words, in nomine patri, was apparent to Edwin's mental perception of the cardinal's voice as his hand made the sign of the cross. A further long breath, sigh, and silent delay by the cardinal conveyed to Edwin the imagined likeness of his face looking back up into Edwin's eyes for a moment, and then repeating the cycle of looking down and back up one more time in turn before continuing. Edwin knew by the mere length of those pauses that more grisly detail was forthcoming. Motionless in dreadful anticipation, Edwin delsent momentarily to gather his nerves, and then finally relsent the remaining portion of the message. The cardinal's words continued inside Edwin's head. When I raised my hand to cross myself, I accidentally brushed against the cloth draping below his waist, and the folds swept up weightless and unhindered in the absence of gravity, the stuff of weight you earth-crawlers so easily take for granted in everything you do. Count yourself fortunate, Edwin. For as the cloth continued up, I could suddenly see... Another oral pause by the cardinal. I saw that Father's legs were gone too, and in the same manner as the arms, the left leg ripped off at the hip joint, and the other sliced cleanly off a few inches below the right hip. Only a space rock's bout of outer darkness disease would even think of such a grotesque manner of amplifying the vileness of the mockery. The cardinal gave no more details of the murder, but connected it to another subject of concern. I think you knew of Father Farbus's reputation as a sculptor and designer of altarpieces, along with his knowledge and study of the artistic works throughout all the 12 jeweled cities in the outer darkness, of the venerable Segundo of Sapphire City. I had appointed Father Farbus postulator of the cause for canonization of Segundo when I was still Bishop of Amadeus, but soon after I had been transferred here to Sapphire City as the Archbishop of the outer darkness. He had told me recently that he had been intrigued by some previously unknown writings of Segundo and their implications for our investigations into Segundo's miracle. On the surface, his murder seems like some demented and bizarre statement about his aesthetic views. but I can't help thinking there might be a connection to the cause for Segundo's canonization. Edwin, you are the person most knowledgeable, next to Father Farbus, about Segundo's works and motivations that I am aware of. I know how difficult it would be for you to even consider, but I would like you to return to the outer darkness and take on Father Farbus's role as postulator for the cause he was working so hard at. I need you here. I am praying for your discernment in this matter. Section: Figure and Ground. Earthcrawler views on the psychological extremes of those drawn to the jeweled cities notwithstanding, the cynical description, outer darkness disease, was eventually reduced simply to the original scriptural source, outer darkness, and became the generic term for space, cultivated by the perceived failure of the vastness of space to reveal new vistas or visions of economic bounty. The science of nearly invisible mechanism for manipulating physical objects had employed seemingly effortless genetically engineered biologic control processes at the brain's cellular level to operate machinery and to transmit remote communication by Elsent. But ironically, it had also rendered the general population's depth of knowledge, along with the perception of any need for such knowledge, virtually non-existent. That lack extended not only across science and technology, but into knowledge of any history deeper than quips and taglines and critical thinking areas as well. To most people, it was seemingly a given that the intuitive physical, mechanical, and mental operation allowed by biologic was perfectly natural. The ability to think things done was the norm for Elsent, and voila! Machines would operate, tasks would be accomplished without effort, and pleasure, worldly or off-worldly, could be pursued endlessly. The presence of biologic was simply natural and not to be wondered at, nor, alternatively, to be wary of. Edwin's own eclectic historical and scientific knowledge, in addition to his primary fascination with art and culture, made him look rather a freak of nature in the eyes of those around him. Combined with his introversion, many of his peers wondered intensely among themselves what possible practical advantage all that so-called knowledge could possibly have for him. The irony of their obliviousness to the existence of their own sense of intense wonder in the midst of that very question they asked themselves about him did not escape Edwin's notice. In any case, lack of depth perception about history by the population at large concerning the origins of space travel had effectively reduced that category of history into the two-word phrase, Jack's Folly. Most people knew only that the nickname in the phrase was apparently a popular leader at the time. Few now could even name the century Jack had lived in, who was instrumental in spurring a passion for opening up and pursuing space travel. His folly, which everyone knew, though few but specialized historians could say how they knew, originated from a highly inspiring line in one of his political speeches from the time period. Despite the even then familiar adage that one could never really go home again, this statesman Jack had apparently declared a daring goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before, at the time of the speech, the decade was out. But the somber physical reality of space travel turned out to be that one could not easily, if at all, ever go home from again, at least not to any home in the gravity well of Earth after an extended stay of weightlessness in space. Initially manifested by the physical effects of long-term space travel on the human body, confirmation of that line's apparent wisdom in its physical sense was finally sealed by the weakness and failure of science, advanced as it was, to fully remedy the condition. For scientific research in all that time had succeeded neither in preventing damage during long-term weightlessness, nor fully repairing the body after the damage had been incurred. Even now Edwin's body harbored lasting effects of his narrow escape from permanent space rock status, accompanied by psychological dread of the rigors involved in the reintroduction of his physical body to Earth gravity. Nevertheless, in the era immediately following politician Jack's famous proclamation, wide-eyed wonder at dark starry night skies persisted, and the legendary, though now generally reviled, Jack, of those halcyon days of space travel was thus credited with initiating a centuries-long, in hindsight, seemingly false hope of justification for the pursuit of space exploration. And yet, ironically, during those intervening centuries, the passion inspired by Jack's Folly evolved eventually into the impetus for the construction and persistence of the jeweled cities. Originally, the cities were touted only as stepping stones at the outside edge of Earth's orbital moat. That moat consisted of the surrounding ring of orbitably useful space ranging from, at the moat's inside border, approximately 100 miles above Earth's surface at low Earth orbit, all the way to the mote's outer border at the 22,000-mile geostationary distance from the Earth's equator. Trajectories farther in space beyond that mote, being outside the geostationary orbit, thus only required orbital velocities slower than Earth's rotational speed in order to maintain a stable orbit. This region had long been called the orbital graveyard, where no longer useful satellites were sent to die. Space clutter sent out to orbital distances beyond the mote would avoid interfering with the closer and therefore faster active orbiting satellites and spacecraft. But with the advent of the orbital stepping stone cities positioned at the orbital mote's outer border in geostationary orbit, the orbital graveyard was soon rejuvenated in developmentally important ways pertinent to the construction and ongoing maintenance of the cities. And in at least one historical instance, the graveyard had, as Edwin's knowledge of Segundo's miracle recalled, also sprung to life in a startling and dramatic manner for the protection of Sapphire City. These stepping stone cities, as they are initially called, were originally intended merely as stopovers for sizable numbers of pioneers and immigrants making the bold leap into deep space. And as such, their construction was anticipated with awe and great excitement. But that passion's fire eventually petered out into empty promise and weary inattention, as it became clear that there really was nowhere to go, where the masses could set up shop, as Edwin's commentary in his Art of Faith journal articles on the local appeal of the jeweled cities had described. Settlements on Earth's moon, or Mars, or even the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, at the extreme, required constant stifling enclosure for the protection of their inhabitants. Though the reduced gravitational pull of those locations provoked a lesser detrimental effect on the human body than zero gravity, the deterioration was still significant enough to impede any easy return to Earth. Planetary and moon-based cities, whether on Earth's own moon or of any other planet in the solar system, proved in the end to hold little more appeal to settlers than in earlier centuries prison camps in the steppes of Siberia on Earth, and interplanetary settlements held far less chance of any escape to better climes. But the stepping stone cities, orbiting the Earth, despite their equally enforced physical enclosure requirements and total gravitational deficiency, had two differences that kept them psychologically accessible, socially viable, and culturally vital. First, their relative proximity to Earth itself allowed for reasonable trade and physical interaction with Earth crawlers when necessary. And second, the very lack of gravity that had effectually rendered them physiological prison camps from the very beginnings of space travel had ironically proven to generate a significant economic boom in the longer run. For the perception of failure in the promise of space had at some point set in motion rapid economic decline in expected returns and valuation of the 12 cities' worth. And so, an otherwise dove-harmless church exercised serpent-wise discernment in securing prominent holdings in the 12 cities from redefined, at very reasonable rates. With a sudden rush of effort, the church harnessed and transmuted that former exploratory and space-mining passion into an aesthetic passion, that is, the love and pursuit of beauty and wonder, a quality in contrast to economic bounty that had, frankly, likely been subconsciously at the root of mankind's desire for space exploration all along. The Church, in her wisdom and recognition of this desire, was able to seduce an influx of artists and aesthetic creation into the permeating weightlessness of space, the amplified design possibilities and structural variation of artistic expression 1,000-fold. Thus, the Church had realized in geostationary orbit the equivalent of, in modern times, the architectural miracle of medieval cathedrals in all their glory in the space of a single generation. And so, the rough-hewn stepping stones into deep space exploration were refashioned. Effectively cut, polished, and reset, the stepping stone cities became a band of brilliant, jeweled cities, from within as well without. Earth-crawlers had long seen the crown of glory band, visible to the naked eye, as a man-made halo around the Earth, rivaling that of Saturn, whose stunning rings had only ever been visible telescopically and were nearly unreachable. But now, the orbiting cities themselves, like heavenly geodes, a mere day's journey across Earth's orbital mote, were, for their inhabitants and visitors, also beautiful jewels from within. Thus, for the overwhelming majority of Earth-crawlers, the cities became the end goal of space travel, enticingly distant from Earth's surface, yet feasibly accessible islands of fantastic imagination and escape into the sea of space, even if the jeweled cities were anchored permanently only at the very edge of the cosmic continental shelf into deep space and the infinite fullness of the outer darkness. The emigrant draw of enhanced psychological extremes induced by weightlessness was complemented by corresponding physical effects. Zero gravity made possible, on the darker end, a seemingly endless variety of realistically portrayed violent enactments, actual self-mutilations of the body and its limbs, and weightless eros. They had become, even back on Earth, the subject of degrading fascination and lewd pornographic addiction. Violent crimes with their own weightless twists had attained legendary status on Earth. Even before Cardinal Marin's Elsent, Edwin had noted with dry resignation recent news of the grim dismemberment case, though no physical details had been divulged in the reporting, befallen upon a fellow art lover and distinguished artist in his own right, whose body, the report said, had been discovered by Cardinal Marin of Holy Crown Cathedral. Edwin knew it would only widen the mutually perceived hell to Abraham's bosom cultural chasm that already separated space rocks from earth crawlers. Though saddened at the news, Edwin also remembered his sigh of relief when he first read of it, recognizing that such things were no longer any of his or his green garden's concern, now that he was once again an established earth-crawler on the planet of his birth. The morning's Elsent from Cardinal Joseph had suddenly made that relief seem more tenuous, despite Edwin's resolve to resist the cardinal's plea to return. He must find the strength to harden his resolve and refuse the request, he determined, and he must be firm in his reply. On the other hand, as an inveterate art lover himself and professional art critic, he harbored a lingering desire for and regretted loss of the aesthetic pleasures permeating the jeweled cities. For what the outer darkness environment had failed to provide in everyday practical earth-based products, it gave in abundance to new aesthetic expression in dance, sculpture, architecture, and interactive kinetic art. Literature and poetry also were not unaffected by the possibilities, and with no distinct sense of up and down in zero gravity, even flat, two-dimensional works were typically composed to be viewed from any angle, fostering a renewed interest in the abstract aesthetic since its rapid decline and disillusionment in the mid-21st century. Even music and vocal performances blossomed with new forms and techniques, a result of zero-gravity effects on the diaphragm and vocal cords. Variations on traditional instruments to accommodate weightless settings and new types of instruments designed specifically for playing under weightless conditions flourished, along with compositions accommodating and taking advantage of those novelties. In fact, Edwin's historical interests and range of knowledge on such matters during his month-long vigil in one of the 12 cities of the outer darkness had been instrumental in his eventual, if sometimes stormy, friendship with a musician and composer who played the sarone, the earliest and one of the most complex musical instruments created that was able to take advantage of zero-gravity performances. The unusually designed ribbed portion of its construction, when fully unfurled out of the instrument's case, surrounded in all directions the back and sides of a musician, like a Marian grotto, its open front granting the performer's visibility to audiences during performances. Edwin had noted in his commentaries its fractal design similarities in appearance to the protective nests surrounding the jeweled cities. But in contrast to the nests whose purpose was to protect those inside from solar radiation outside, the sarone's shell was intended to project music of the performer out to the audience. By capturing all of a player's physical motions and gestures while performing within its concavity, it was capable of transferring the subtlest intentions of every part of the musician's body into musical sublimity, a factor that rendered it an ultimate expressive instrument by virtuoso performers. But its extreme difficulty and mastery, in concert with its long outdated retention of analog methods of converting physical touch and motion detection into sound rather than by Elsent, had rendered its use now as more an archaic curiosity in the musical world. Edwin's musical friend had cleverly bartered that curiosity in order to effect no small degree of recognition in the art world, both in the outer darkness and back on Earth. And that dual capacity of the sarone was part of what created an audience for such arcane performances in both places. For though not universal, the majority of concert venues in the outer darkness typically employed a three-dimensional version of earth-crawler theater in the round, where an audience-sized bubble allowed the performer in the center to be surrounded in all directions and viewing from all angles by concert-goers. But there was a strong contingent of aesthetic opinion that human interaction, and therefore aesthetic decisions in artistic works, was properly and most efficiently defined by human physiology and mental orientation. The strictly recognized, even if only locally, up and down, along with its corollary recognition of right and left, as well as front and back, was deemed a vital aspect of this critical view of art. And it was these precepts that dictated the construction, even in the outer darkness, of many venues with a stage area decidedly situated at one end of the venue, rather than artists performing in the center of a bubble. And likewise on Earth, where a theater in the round was, instead, the odd curiosity among the far more common venue, with the stage area at one end of a venue. The surround's construction and operation and projection of sound out in a particular direction, defined as front, played to this sizable portion of the public's recognition of up-down, right-left, front-back necessity in true human interactions and relations for both earth-crawler and space rock status. The opposition, primarily originating in the gravity-free realm of the outer darkness, was composed of proponents of an orientation-free aesthetic, and had led to legendary art critic debate battles for at least a good 2 centuries with no end in sight. Apart from this ongoing debate, many fantastically imagined visions created in other physical art forms could be facilitated by an infinitely adjustable level of gravitational effect, from the weightlessness of zero gravity up to the several g-force limits of human endurance. But the structural and energy requirements and rotational mechanisms for producing those gravitational variations in large-scale arenas was only feasible for relatively short periods of time. And the already zero-gravity weakened physical condition of most space rocks reduced those limits of endurance even further. So apart from the occasional spin-off art effect, as such artificial gravity events were punningly called, near constant zero-gravity weightlessness was otherwise the residential norm in the outer darkness. But, as Edwin wrote in commentary, sufficient numbers of emigrants were willing to forego the healthy embrace of gravity to transform the cities from failed engines of space exploration into a veritable gallery row of art colonies in the outer darkness, with enough tourist trade to keep them economically viable. It was in this latter capacity that Edwin had engaged the cities once before as art historian and architectural critic in his long-term review of the 12 churches with their unearthly design and almost mischievously varied religious art during his own, initially intended, year-long pilgrimage around the encircling necklace of jeweled cities in the outer darkness. Section: Complementary Colors. Edwin's aesthetic tastes were modern and eclectic, but his practices were decidedly archaic. With bold impracticality, he took time and effort to print the outer darkness Elsent from Cardinal Marin onto fine hand-pressed paper and promptly Delsent for mental isolation to avoid distraction inside his head as he read it over again, this time only as printed words to study them more carefully. The aural variety of Elsent that the Cardinal seemed to use exclusively induced internal mental sounds in his head, something his already overactive brain did not need. He held the pages of the missive slightly bent and propped up in one hand to reconsider its hard words. He sipped imported coffee from an artisan's pottery wheel-thrown mug held in the other hand, relishing the fact that even this innocent pleasure was physically impractical in a gravity-free environment. He smiled as he recalled his machinations in downing his first pint of bitter in the outer darkness. Negotiating the specially designed tankards required for the weightless environment induced a learning curve for newcomers that often led to comical results. Something so otherwise simple and intuitive for earth-crawlers was not to be taken lightly in the outer darkness. He put the letter down and looked out into the garden again, contemplating whether the outer darkness is a dead end was just too harsh as a reply to one so far up in the hierarchy of the church. Finally, he got up from his chair and walked outside to the garden as a silent but defiant declaration of this green patch of earth that was part of his home. It was something he wandered about in daily, feet treading on stone pathways, hands snipping sprigs of low-growing herbs below, arms reaching up to prune tree branches and overgrown vines above, and bent knees sinking into damp earth while his fingers dug rows for vegetable seeds or yanked weeds out of decorative rock and pebble-bordered patchworks of perennials growing out of solid, flat ground. Edwin would be the first to insist that he was the quintessential embodiment of the outer darkness bantering term of denigration used by space rocks, earth-crawler, and he wore the moniker proudly. The garden's entrance formed an arch of interwoven cut branches, the product of his feeble handiwork from last winter's prunings. Too low, really, to serve as a proper gateway for an earth-crawler of his height. He had to stoop every time he passed under it, but it was too late now to raise its haloed crown higher. Passion-flower vines grew at both bases, and had already wound their way up through the mesh, spilling out the occasional crimson blossom. Edwin couldn't bear to uproot them now, instead giving in to their demand for his entry's submissive bow of the head. As his head dipped, he insisted to himself that the arch's braided branches, interspersed with bright red blossoms every foot or so along the arch, were not, after all, very much like the night-blooming sparks of light from the arc of the orbiting cities high above his little fenced-in garden. Why that comparison even occurred to him in the first place he couldn't fathom. It was just one more unexpected association his brain presented to him almost continuously on automatic. That persistent inborn mental activity had often kept him awake at night if he couldn't manage to shut it off with the soothing focus of repetitious rosary meditations or readings from the Psalms. Most particularly and often, the subtle variations and intricately interwoven tapestry of meditations on divine law in the 176 verses of Psalm 119. Edwin passed under the archway, and all but one of the birds in the garden flew off at the intruder's approach. A lone, sharply delineated red cardinal, not originally a native species to Edwin's area, was equally defiant against Edwin's own determined entrance. Perched atop the arched entry, darting its head inward and outward over the garden, it was ever watchful for prey and predator in sky and earth. Then, swift as an arrow, it shot to the ground in front of Edwin and pecked in the dirt, searching. Abruptly, its head raised, a wriggling earthworm clasped in its beak. It darted back to the top of the arch for a few seconds, glared again at the intruder standing just a couple steps inside the arched entrance, as if daring him to try leaving the enclosure, and then flew off into the nearby wisteria, the worm still dangling from its beak. The nest of chicks within the concealing greenery would feast. If this was God's wry answer to the prayer he had uttered to himself in his study not 10 minutes earlier, coupled with the imagery from his vision of the nest of flightless and helpless chicks gorging on the brightly colored worms, Edwin were not amused. Or was this just another unexpected and seemingly random association presented to him by his brain? Regardless, he had already virtually made up his mind not to accede to the summons by Cardinal Joseph Marin of the Archdiocese in the outer darkness requesting his services. After all, as he had reasoned only a few minutes earlier, calmly sitting at his desk inside, it was like asking a lone and reluctant fisherman to launch into the deep with a small boat and attempt some unreasonable and likely dangerous task. Edwin's only delay at this point was whether or not to tone down his imagined curt reply. Someone else could investigate the cause for beatification of the venerable segundo of Sapphire City, where Holy Crown Cathedral and its cardinal were seated. And that other dismemberment matter in the cardinal's aural, well, best to step gingerly around such an unsavory subject. Edwin's aesthetic critical skills were not accustomed to assessing and analyzing murder scenes. In any case, of what possible use could a determined earth-crawler like himself have for church beatification proceedings, or for investigations into ugly space rock homicidal activity? A priest or monk, or any of the other higher-ups of the damned clergy, Edwin crossed himself in reaction to his irreverent thought, but truth be told, unrepentant, would be better suited than a mere tertiary, surely. And police were clearly better suited for, well, police matters, especially for matters where weightless anomalies in zero-gravity conditions could wreak havoc with earth-crawler up is up and down is down reflexes and inertial habits of life in a gravity well. Besides, it would require him to succumb to the very conditions he had determined never to return to, and for an unspecified, but clearly physically detrimental, not to mention potentially re-addicting, period of time under weightless conditions. It was too much to ask. He would not become one more space rock forever encaged in the outer darkness, if he could help it, no matter what appeal it might hold for his aesthetic muse. The cardinal flew back to the top of the arch, its empty beak announcing that the captive earthworm was now nourishing the cardinal's needy brood, hidden from view within the wisteria. The passion-flower-red bird stared down at the verdant garden's current earth-crawling intruder, even more defiantly, if possible, than before. Edwin's vigorous arm-waving could do nothing to dissuade the creature's now unwavering glare or frighten it enough to leave the archway above. A phrase from that morning's reading echoed in Edwin's head, reverberating back and forth between his eye sockets as they locked onto the cardinal's piercing gaze, one more unexpected association presented to him by his brain. Nevertheless, at thy word I will let down the net. And like St. Peter's net, Edwin sank to his knees, defeated. A light rain began washing its joyful tears down from the sky over his forehead. He reached to the ground and ran his outstretched fingers through the flat, dampened earth in desperation to hold on to it. The clods of dirt crumbled at his touch. The cardinal flew back to its nest. The sky turned downpour. Section: Negative space. Edwin stepped from the liner's ramp onto the floating sea launch platform, last of the visitors and emigrants making the latest flight up into the outer darkness. Under the shade of his upturned hand, while his unaccustomed eyes adjusted to the undiminished glare of the unclouded sky, he gazed with unease at the undulating ocean-blue waters, receding unhindered to the horizon in all directions and uninterrupted by any trace of land, but his unease was due neither to the sky's untempered brightness nor the water's unrelenting activity under him. The platform was motionless. Internal motion-neutralizing elements canceled out any trace of the water's stirrings. The platform's eerie, static isolation suggested a vague, uninterested detachment from communion with natural settings. To Edwin, it was an earthly daytime reflection of the blank steadiness exhibited by the orbiting cities overhead at night, whose geostationary orbits were equally unchanging against the ocean of stars that stream across a midnight black sky. Edwin looked about his surroundings for any stray object he could toss out over the railing into the waters below. To watch it arc down to the surface with a splash of interaction, and then to see it disappear into the depths, suddenly seemed vital to him. It would provide some sort of existential verification, no matter how small, that he, at least, was still part of the freedom of Earth's circle, regardless of anything that might happen to him upon his return to the outer darkness. But everything on the platform was firmly attached, maximally efficient, and singularly functional in its express purpose of providing transport to the orbiting jeweled cities high overhead. Even his pockets, but for one item, contained nothing superfluous that he could part with. The official guidelines for the journey had stressed that passengers must board carrying no just-in-case extras on their person. The purported reason was to cultivate a letting-go frame of mind for the journey. Detachment was encouraged by Redefined to help passengers prepare for the reported freeing, though initially disorienting, effect that extended weightlessness would confer on the human body. Edwin had a natural gathering instinct, hoarding, some had called it back at the Abbey. He framed it as enshrining in his own mind. But that instinct was rendered helpless and gasping for air by the prospect of Redefined's detachment protocol. The 600 passengers split up into designated parties of 50, each group heading off toward one of the 12 lovely avian graceful craft. The flowing lines of the ships, in sharp contrast to the platform's blunt, angular, and orthogonal structure, were a practical concession to earth-crawlers as organic visual relief, distracting their gaze from the sterile platform architecture. But Edwin was still reeling from his desire to rebel against the directive's detachment purposes. So instead, the procession of passengers into the sleek ships gave him another of the unexpected associations presented to his brain. A bizarre and ironic impression of portable bird-shaped transport cages being loaded with willing cargo eager to forego Earth's freedom in order to convey them to geostationary orbital boundaries, many of them bound for eventual wing-clipping and permanent captivity in the outer darkness. The transparent forward hulls, a preview of the far larger shelled enclosures they were headed toward, were roughly cylindrical and dome-capped, with seats angled variously around the circle, affording passengers a grand 360-degree panoramic view of the skyward journey. This was another subtle form of planned detachment, designed to dissolve Earth-crawler naive notions of up and down. In weightless living conditions, such antiquated Earth-centered biases could be extremely counterproductive, and dangerous in most cases. Edwin remembered the awkwardness of one of his early conversations out there, trying to concentrate on the topic at hand while looking into a face tilted 170 degrees so that it was nearly, but not quite, upside down. Talking to a group of people, each one positioned at different random angles, like a stop-motion image of a stack of playing cards tossed into the air in front of the speaker, not a chair to sit in or a floor to stand upon in sight, was even more disorienting. But it made for fascinating interaction regardless, so the impending spectacle of experiencing space all around drew the attentions of the other passengers, less introspective than Edwin, away from the impression of claustrophobic enclosure from the vessels they were entering, as well as from undue anticipation of the larger enclosures of the jeweled cities they would be journeying toward, for the time being. Redefined liftoffs from seaport to low Earth orbit transfer station were in stark contrast to the grueling high-acceleration launches by roaring dinosaur rockets of the early space age. They began with a gentle rise from the platform's surface, allowing the dozen ships to form a familiar arrowhead lambda configuration along the flared branches of a virtual particle wake left by the leading quantum condensate generation unit. The flock was thus able to harness a feedback loop of integrated tensor energy, acronymed as FLITE, flight. The resulting low yet insistent acceleration, upward sweep of soaring flight, was strong enough to exhilarate the captive audience without inducing nauseous reactions common to earlier brute force methods of achieving orbital velocity. But comfortable as it was, the easing lift, in fact, manifested another stage of Redefind's planned detachment from nature by eliminating any visceral reaction of the body's normal physical excess warning systems, at least during this initial stage of the trip. His previous assignment to the outer darkness had armed Edwin with first-hand experience of the dangers inherent in this mounting detachment. He knew well the subsequent draining withdrawal symptoms of recovery from an aversion to Earth's gravitational field, induced by long-term weightlessness, as well as the required adaptation to various permanent side effects that passengers returning to Earth at a later time might have to endure. But at the moment he thought only of the impending trial of terror that most of the people on board would experience at the next stage of their flight into the outer darkness. Its greatest intensity would bloom as the flock of ships waded through the Earth's orbital moat between low Earth and geostationary orbits. But its initial manifestations would begin even before they reached the low Earth orbit transfer station. The other passengers were oblivious to the approaching trial. Redefined was silent about the curious and utter refusal of travelers to later make any reference at all to the experience with friends back on Earth, either after they had returned or even while living in the jeweled cities if they decided, as many did, to stay there permanently. And Redefined made no effort itself to advertise the effect to first-time travelers as a warning of what was coming during the flight out. So the passengers gazed around eagerly in all directions through the ship's transparent hull in anticipation of the flight's commencement and progression, while Edwin looked down at his lap resignedly. He pulled from his pocket the one article that he would not willingly part from when he was searching for something to toss out over the launch platform railing earlier. His frustrated rebellion at the platform's intransigence to the motion of the sea around it did not extend that far. Against the published guidelines, he had taken it along, even though he would have been adept enough at keeping track manually without it, but its physical presence was a sure comfort in his hands. He closed his eyes to the spectacle of the soaring liftoff of the flock of ships, and fingering the string of beads, began praying a rosary centered on the Stella Maris mysteries, or sea mysteries, as they were commonly referred to. To the rosary's three long-standing traditional sets of mysteries, joyful, sorrowful, and glorious, St. Pope John Paul II had unexpectedly, after half a millennium, added at the beginning of the 21st century a fourth set, the luminous mysteries. The sea mysteries, decreed a century ago now by St. Pope Brendan II, had been the seventh and presumably final set of mysteries, there now being one set designated for each day of the week. The sea mysteries were particularly promulgated in recognition of those working and living in the outer darkness under the extraordinary circumstances of that environment. These supplications were intended to confer special graces by their contemplation and were especially loved by the space rocks of the faith. The five mysteries, culled from events associated with the sea in the Gospels and the Revelation of John, were referred to individually as 1. Fishers of men, 2. Walking on water, 3. Calming the storm, 4. 153 large fish, and 5. Sea of glass. Edwin's special intentions for the rosary included an intercessory prayer of resilience for the passengers on this particular flight, recalling the trauma that he knew many of them would soon experience. As he began reciting the rosary's first decade for the Fishers of Men mystery silently, the upward arc of their trajectory separated the arrowed array of ships from the endless sea below. Like a stone hurled out into the ocean, but without any recognizable splash of interaction, the flock of ships disappeared into the depths of the outer darkness above. The unexpected association with his frustration back at the seaport launch platform presented itself to his brain, and Edwin realized that he himself was now that stray, unattached object he had earlier looked for to toss out over the railing. Again, Simon Peter's words that he had recalled in his garden came back to him. "Nevertheless, at thy word, I will let down the net." But this time, the unexpected image presented to his brain showed that it was he being caught in a net of stars, to be drawn up into the outer darkness. Closing his eyelids even more firmly, he began reciting silently to himself the first Fishers of Men decade. "Of Stella Maris, star of the sea," implored Edwin for her prayers. "Hail Mary, full of grace." In the early history of spaceflight, astronauts had been carefully selected for endurance and resistance to the often egregious effects of space travel, particularly the initial launch into orbit, When space travel eventually became a reasonable economic alternative for the typical Earth crawler, as well as commercially implementing the gentler flight drives on passenger ships, certain physical and mental effects still persisted. Efforts were made to suppress that initial shock to the average human mind and body. They were generally successful, due to the psychologically oriented detachment effects instilled into passengers by redefined procedures. But most passengers nevertheless experienced, in varied degrees of intensity, several undesirable side effects. The most prevalent, though a lucky few seemed entirely immune to its effects, was a counterintuitive and rapidly escalating sense of confinement and smothering closeness the further out one traveled into the vastness of space. A line from a 20th century author's children's story, "The inside is bigger than the outside," found its contrapositive equivalent in a taunting jab about Earth's wide-open spaces compared to that sense of close confinement in the outer darkness and its orbiting cities, penned by a cynical earth-crawler from a later century. A heavenly shell and a gravity well were face to face in a race for space. The outer darkness was a stout anarchist, but the planet's surface had the grandest purpose. Open east and west, while a space rock nest was a rounded berth smaller than a grounded earth crawler. And so, with increasing velocity, many of the passengers began to experience a time-lapse-like rapid transition as the Earth's vast ocean-blue surface receded behind them. Like Edwin's vision looking out over his garden, the passengers saw the remote sky-blue expanses above fade into a deepening sapphire twilight, closing in around the ships. Their peripheral vision folded inward, and susceptible passengers had the distinct impression that it was the Earth, rather, that was departing rapidly from behind the ships. In their eyes, they seemed to become engulfed by the dark hole of the sky, a cave with indigo walls only a few arm-lengths away and strewn with piercingly bright pinhole starlights. At that point, the stifling black vacuum of the outer darkness covered them like a blanket of heavy wool in blistering summer heat. Most of the passengers experienced a sense of an impending panic attack as they began to feel as though the interior side of the ship's transparent shell would shrink-wrap itself around them. Were they not constrained by auto-retracting harnesses to prevent escaping more than a body's length from their seats, chaos would have reigned inside the hull. The flock's carefully calculated trajectory was designed to minimize the time span of this deeply embedded visual impression, or the claustrophobic stress had been unbearable for many of the travelers. But even this shortened, yet just long enough, endurance test was a deliberate ingredient introduced by Redefined as a fourth enhancement of detachment from the boundaries of Earth's surface. After a short delay for chemical fueling and orbital alignment at the low Earth orbit transfer station, the flock's migration lambda pattern broke up. Each ship now continued, under normal chemical propulsion, on its own inerrant trajectory around the circle of the globe, decelerating and widening its orbit outward, until arriving at last in the dock of its particular destination nest, one ship at each of the 12 jeweled cities in the outer darkness. This last leg had become a harrowing, skin-crawling journey for the passengers, as they looked in panic for any way of escape from their perceived constriction. A second unstated and darker reason for Redefined's restriction on just-in-case pocket-held items became apparent. Even a necklace or a string of beads might have been used injudiciously by a wild-eyed passenger in this state, either against other passengers or to his own physical harm. Edwin was fingering his smuggled rosary now, with his eyes still closed in prayer to strangle any potential for the panic he had experienced on his previous trip to the outer darkness. Aside from the currently prayed Ave bead between thumb and fingers of his right hand, he held the cross and pinned the rosary under his left palm to prevent the increasingly weightless string from drifting up into the visible range of the passengers he prayed solemnly for. Ironically, he tried unsuccessfully to tune out the rasping commotion and struggles of one of the very passengers he was praying for that he could hear going on somewhere behind him. It was only once inside the orbiting cities that passengers could retrieve a sense of freedom from the tightening grip of the flight into space. The giant crystalline eggshell-like structures of the cities, even as enclosures themselves, nevertheless seemed, at this stage, like heavenly abodes for the desperate hatchlings of brood parasites, destined, as many of them would be, for flightless abandonment of Earth's former freedoms. Redefined had taken undisclosed steps to eradicate the human body's last gasp of physical excess warnings by subjecting the passengers to that final virtual dry heave effect before reaching one of the nests. The time-released progression had been initiated even before their arrival at the seaport launch platforms, when passengers had been encouraged, an encouragement refused by Edwin this time around, to pass through a radiation tolerance checkpoint. Controlled bursts of hyperviolet wavelength radiation provoked sight intensification in neuronal synapses by activating undocumented biological algorithms in the passenger's genetically implanted at birth Elsent DNA. Post-flight, this invocation of near panic was followed by carefully administered doses of visual indecision and coordination-easing bursts to numb the stress of the flight's closing trauma and bring them back to a sense of calm. A common side effect of the trauma, redefined claiming it to be unintended, was a resulting vague fear of the return journey to Earth with anticipated possible recurrence of the trauma. That trauma was also suspected of augmenting the incidence of violent, obsessive, and often surreal-flavored crime sprees associated with a renegade subculture in the jeweled cities, again, redefined, denying any direct link. Regardless, the repair of induced panic back into a relieving calm after docking at one of the orbiting cities completed the redefined process of detachment orientation for extended time period visitors, and especially for emigrants planning a life at home in the orbiting nests of the outer darkness. Section: Composition and Form. They went a little overboard with the bird's nest imagery, huh? A swiftly whirring passenger overtook Edwin's more casual rhythm and waved a finger past the nearby arc-rad stabilized structures surrounding them in all directions. Like the sea launch platform back on Earth, they were unnaturally, to Edwin's earth-crawler eyes, and utterly stationary in relation to each other and to the city's surrounding protective nest, even with many of them physically unattached to anything and isolated from each other. The waving finger instead pointed at the nearly mile-wide concave inner surface of the far side of the city's primary shell. Back on Earth, Edwin had waited in the sea liner docked at the seaport launch site so that he could be the last to exit in order to avoid the crowds transferring to the 12 spacecrafts that would ferry them to the outer darkness. But since he had made a previous trip to the outer darkness, he was already adept at weightless maneuvering. Upon arrival at Sapphire City, he was therefore best able to avoid the crowds now by leaving the ship first, before first-time passengers even had time to practice what space rocks called whirving. In the orbiting nests of the outer darkness, legs provided little functional value under weightless conditions, and were often disruptive in crowded areas, especially by unaccustomed earth-crawlers flailing them about in a futile attempt to walk or push off non-existent surfaces out of habit. Consequently, both legs were often tucked back at the knee, loosely bound, allowing some movement, even casual if unhurried full extension when necessary, but with enough restriction to prevent inadvertent sudden full extensions that might otherwise accidentally kick others nearby, especially in high-traffic passageway tubes or crowded open areas in the shells. Automated tail-like attachments, called whirfins, were secured over the legs and lower torso. Whirfins were Elsent sensitive even to the subtlest intentional motions by experienced wearers, allowing for a smooth, virtually unconscious and automatic aquatic-like whirving motion through the air of the giant crystalline enclosures of a city's zero-gravity interior. The enclosures were often referred to by the fanciful name seashells. But a whirfin wearer had to first become accustomed to the sensation of maneuvering about while wearing a whirfin, so first-time visitors underwent short instruction on whirving upon arrival. The fellow passenger, apparently likewise previously skilled in whirving, had quickly overtaken Edwin, who was more leisurely venturing into the city's largest primary shell, wherein blossomed the highlight of Sapphire City. Mother Church, by virtue of her serpent-wise investment and acquired holdings, had gained interior design control of the city's primary living area shells. With this authority, she had reinstituted the norm of medieval townships long abandoned by earth-crawlers, so that in the outer darkness, a central church was the focal point in each of the 12 cities, visible and attention-grabbing from any of the city's primary shells within its surrounding protective nest. Even from the smallest isolated shells of monasteries and convents, arc-rad away and physically disconnected from the primary shells of the city proper, and typically much closer to the inside surface of the nest's wall, visitors could still get their bearings with glimpses of a city's central church from these relatively distant vantage points. Sapphire City's geostationary position over Rome and Jerusalem had been the impetus for its self-chosen European cultural and historical influence from among Earth's 12 continents and oceans, and Holy Crown Cathedral was the most elaborate of the 12 cities' churches. Its design was intended as a fully three-dimensional and zero-gravity manifestation of the familiar fractaline patterns of arches within arches within arches of medieval cathedral architecture on Earth. Edwin had earlier noted its influence on the genius of the often inscrutable artist Segundo, noted for his pervasive and intentional use of fractaline characteristics. For here was displayed, from any angle, a magnificent array of crystalline shells within shells within shells, some as large as Earth's tallest skyscrapers, others small enough to hold in one's arms had they been plucked petals from a delicate but intricate flower, and each a member of several levels of structure and complexity in the cathedral's overall design. And here also was displayed, in glorious audacity, the mental detachment required to take in the differences between gravity-limited buildings on Earth and zero-gravity structures in the outer darkness. The flying buttresses of Earth's cathedrals, as stunningly designed as medieval architects could muster, were nevertheless necessarily submissive to the demands of gravitational forces and structural support. But zero-gravity environment had no requirement for an overly firm base foundation from which to build up, or for buttresses to reinforce from the sides. Instead, shelled branches grew both outward and inward from an enormous primary shell, weaving and intertwining in all directions in unearthly and hypnotizing patterns, from large-scale tower-like arrays to mid-level parish and chapel enclosures, and all the way down to detailed filigree work in human body-sized labyrinths and pathways for meditation. And yet its overall design as a structured composition held one's gaze in contemplation from a distance, in any orientation and from any direction, one of the hallmarks of Segundo's style that Edmund had documented extensively during his previous pilgrimage and subsequent art critic commentary in the Art of Faith journal. Though it had been the furthest thing in his mind when he had first planted them, the violet-blue flowering clusters of the wisteria vines growing in his garden back on Earth bore, Edwin now realized, a distinct likeness to the primarily sapphire-toned pattern he now saw blooming in the totality of Holy Crown Cathedral's architecture. And suddenly he saw before him, translated into human reality, the needy brood nesting in the wisteria of his garden, where the red cardinal bird had secreted its captive worm from the garden dirt, and where Edwin had bowed his head at its arched entrance, and had knelt finally into that garden dirt, in submission to Cardinal Marin's summons. For as he watched, large numbers of the city's space rocks were entering the cathedral's flowering doors, worming their way to Mass to be fed like an enormous school of hungry fish. The doors, like Simon Peter's nets strained to their breaking point on the lake of Gennesaret, could barely contain the crowds pressing in through them. Were there really this many of the faithful among the many millions of residents in the outer darkness? Earth-crawlers back on the planet virtually always only heard about the raw, salacious stories and crime sprees that seemingly flooded the orbiting cities. Had there been a sudden growth in numbers of the faithful? Or perhaps there was another side of the population that Edwin had simply ignored on his previous year-long review of the churches. Where had they come from? Could he have been so blind back then? Had they always been there? It seemed to him now as though he had toiled through the night and caught sight of nothing like this congregation of the faithful in his previous tour of the cities. Edwin, in his realization, suddenly wanted to exclaim to Cardinal Marin that if he could miss something so obvious before, he was unworthy and incapable of helping the church to decide on the sainthood of this strange man, Segundo of Sapphire City. Segundo was a fellow space rock in whom these worshippers would find deep comfort asking for his prayers, should he be canonized. Edwin was a self-professed outsider and a collector of arcane aesthetic opinions about art that was divorced from his earth-crawling garden. How could he presume to act in their interest? He determined to ask Cardinal Marin's leave to go back to Earth and let someone else. But whom? In his weightless airbound position in the middle of the city's largest seashell, there was nothing he could kneel on, even though the Werfen already bound his legs into a kneeling position. He would only be able to curl up further into a fetal position and beg for release from the Cardinal's appointed task, and then to depart from him like a sinner revealed as hypocrite. The unexpected image of mere sinful fisherman Peter, on his knees imploring Christ to depart from him, coursed through his brain like a searing bolt of lightning. It was then that the woman passing by had pointed to the far wall of the city's primary outer shell and commented about its likeness to a bird's egg, interrupting his internal dialogue with himself. Edwin recognized the voice and tapped the shoulder of the passing figure as she advanced ahead of him. She turned her head to look back at him as he said matter-of-factly, "Kieran, you are on the flight out here to Sapphire City." She pursed her lips and raised her eyes with a mock quizzical look and said casually, "I think so," smiling. Whirring faster, she had moved yards ahead by now, and Edwin caught her up and asked, "Did you know I was coming here? Why didn't you say something earlier?" "I saw you standing at the railing alone when we arrived at the sea launch platform," she replied. "But I could tell you were in a contemplative mood. I do recognize the posture that you adopt, whether in a gravity well or zero gravity, if you are in transit to a philosophical debate with yourself, you know. I knew better than to interrupt that journey, but just now I decided to ignore my better judgment this once, even though you still appeared to be traveling deep into that interminable soul-searching journey." Kieran, 2 feet away, stared directly into his eyes to watch his reaction. He averted his gaze and looked toward the transparent concave shell wall far away that she had pointed to initially. "What do you mean by overboard?" he asked. He counted on their previous involved discussions of current and historical aesthetic notions in order to veer from the imminent and uncomfortably personal topic she had just broached. She accepted the diversion and gestured again to the far wall of the shell. "Oh, you know, the nests and all. It was already precious enough to make the cities look like a bird's nest with eggs in the center, and even more precious to give it that Easter egg basket look. But Immediately Edwin was in his element and interrupted her. Edwin's particular knowledge in this area came to the forefront. "They weren't designed that way in imitation," he began. "The so-called nests surround the shells from the back and around the sides of the cities to screen out the most harmful radiation from the sun in those directions. But the Earth itself and the width of its own Van Allen radiation belts block the sun's most intense direct rays from the Earth-facing side of a city, so the nest can be open in that direction. And the crystalline materials of the shells inside the nests are impregnated with polarized impurities to attenuate dangerous radiation from any of the remaining less intense rays. That polarization accounts for the colored Easter egg impression that Earth crawlers see in telescopes from the ground, and even visitors here inside the cities experience that impression, up close, you might say. So it only ends up looking like a nest of eggs by accident." "Fine," admitted Kieran. "But I was thinking mainly about the actual shapes of the shells inside the nests. They're even narrowed at one end like real birds' eggs on Earth. A little obsessive if you ask me. Wouldn't a purely spherical shape have been stronger and a more efficient use of materials?" Kieran knew when to back off the personal commentary of her initial comments about his pensive moods and engage him in a debate like this. His favorite pastime, it seemed. Edwin fired back as if reading from a prepared speech. His sabbatical research had delved into this subject extensively in preparation for his architectural critique of the churches and their art. "The shells weren't designed that way in imitation of birds' eggs either. The process itself dictates their final shape. You may have seen the enormous shell fabrication site off in the distance on the flight out here. It's in a higher, more distant orbit, past geostationary orbit out in the satellite graveyard. Compared to the speed of the cities that exactly match the rotation of the Earth, the fabrication site, further out in a slower orbit, regresses gradually, seeming to go backward around the equator from the city's point of view. That way, completed shells can be easily shuttled off to the appropriate city as they pass by the fabrication site. And the fabrication site avoids getting in the way of ships and other satellites in faster orbits below geostationary orbit. Back in the earlier days of the jeweled cities, the shell fab site ironically brought the satellite graveyard back to life by providing for the city's maintenance needs, not to mention the incredible part it played in Segundo's miracle. So pervasive was the general population's current lack of knowledge or interest in history and science that Edwin wondered if even she, despite her own recent professional interest in Segundo's life, knew about that event so vital to Sapphire City's continued existence today. Kieran reveled inwardly at her insight into Edwin's motivations and interests and distractions, and her savvy in extracting them, even from within his enclosed shell of introversion. By questioning the foundations of the architectural structures that he had gone into such detail about in his critiques of the art and churches of the outer darkness in the past, she was able to draw him out. But at the same time, she found herself admiring his unfeigned enthusiasm on the subjects he loved. Not a hint of trying to impress, simply launching into his joy of expressing interesting ideas, so different than the self-absorbed internal struggles and psychological debates with himself that she had witnessed often enough in the past. "Anyway," Edwin continued, "generating large enclosed volumes with the least amount of raw material in a vacuum with zero gravity to boot is the trick. Enormous bubbles of thin, pliable material are manufactured and inflated at the shell fab site, much like a party balloon. After it is inflated, it doesn't take much air pressure at all to do so in a vacuum, of course. An ion feeding device inside the bubble near one end emits bursts of molecular plasma that build up crystalline microlayers on the inner surface of the bubble. Kieran smiled as his hands crossed over each other and formed, mime-like, an imaginary dome around the front of his face in an attempt at physical expression of the inside of a bubble. Under stable conditions in zero gravity, the bubble would certainly take on a nearly perfectly spherical shape, as you suggest. But since the bubble is anchored to the feeding device at one end, the bubble's enormous size and light initial weight are distorted both by the solar wind and the trajectory of the plasma bursts inside the bubble itself. That causes them to take on distinct bird's egg shapes before the crystalline layers have a chance to solidify into their final shapes. Two aspects that can be controlled easily are the rate of plasma deposit. Slower rates can allow a more elongated and narrowed at one end effect. An angular relation between the solar wind pressure and the position and direction of the ion feeding device can create a degree of bending in some of the more elongated shapes. A couple of the jeweled cities have taken advantage of those features in their overall design goals. By the way, Edwin began, another unexpected association arising in his brain. Serendipitously, natural sound inside the completed shells is reflected like a lamp at the focal point of a parabolic or elliptic mirror from that narrowed end out into the wider end. They make wonderful concert hall spaces for orchestral and vocal works and live speeches to large audiences. Priests typically need no amplification devices to be heard in large sanctuary shells during Mass. And you couldn't ask for a better environment for the performing arts, which I guess must be why you come up here so often to perform your own works on your sarong. I had an entire chapter in my reviews about the tonal— Well, perhaps, Kieran conceded. They say form follows function, but apparently bird words follow the form, including, I suppose, the shell fab site's nickname, shelled Fabergé eggs. Or at least that's what earth crawlers call it, she said. She was trying to steer the conversation back to the shells, experiencing at the moment her own reluctance at venturing into certain personal areas. And by the way, she continued, all this talk of avian terms and clergy reminds me of cardinals. Cardinal Marin, to be precise. He wants to see you immediately after the Mass that's just about to begin. He said he couldn't contact you directly back at the sea launch platform, so he sent me. But I didn't want to interrupt your debate with yourself there. You must have delsent and forgot to relsent later. Or maybe that was an intentional act of isolation on your part? Were you trying to avoid interruptions? She gave him that knowing smile, looking directly into his eyes again. She added a second strike. I remember the first time I saw you in that isolation tank mode at Chalcedony Colony. We were looking at Segundo's shell sculpture of the first Fishes of Men sea mystery in St. Pope Brendan II Church. Even just seeing that note about Segundo's private name for the sculpture, Wormbait, as one of his alleged visions, apparently triggered your isolation mode. You were so absorbed with his portrayal of Peter as the worm on the fishing pole, instead of the fisherman holding the pole, that I couldn't get your attention for a good 20 minutes or more. How should I attempt to break into that tank in the future whenever the need arises? Or should I just wait for you to emerge? Her torso, in a typically random orientation encountered in zero gravity, was swept back at a steep angle to the plane of Edwin's body. Her arms, though relaxed, were bent at the elbows, and her empty hands were open, as though she might be pleading with him. Her head was tilted back slightly, and her eyes would have seemed to an earth crawler to be looking up at him. Edwin was reminded instantly of their first meeting during his earlier pilgrimage to the jeweled cities. But instead of the Renaissance painting angelic figure above him, announcing "Fear not," that he had envisioned at that meeting, Edwin could almost imagine her now as a parched traveler below, at his feet crawling on desert sand, searching for water. Or, as another unexpected and contrasting opposite image presented itself to his brain, her Werfen swaying gently from side to side conjured in his mind a vaguely dangerous but alluring mermaid. Her steady gaze gave him a slightly unnerving, thirsty yet inquisitive impression. Edwin cocked a puzzled eye, trying to put the sequence of events at the sea launch platform she had just mentioned together in his mind. After a moment's pause, he shrugged his shoulders, mimicking her voice and the facial expressions she had adopted as she answered his first question when she had passed by him earlier. "I think so," he said, and smiled back. Section Chiaroscuro. Just report what you find out about that notorious artist. No more, no less. Don't worry about any impressions it might create about Segundo, good or bad. The damn clergy, as you say, will deal with your findings and worry about impressions afterwards. Cardinal Marin opened a panel on an oval teak cabinet of hand-carved Polynesian design and removed 2 blown-glass Klein bottle-shaped steins with actual leather-skinned squeeze bladders. He continued, "They say brew in zero gravity has a quality that can't be duplicated on Earth. Not sure how the physics of the outer darkness affect a plant's development and flavor or the fermentation process, but I think it's true. The brewer has to apply his art too, though. The best brew doesn't just happen. Segundo himself was rumored to be an aficionado of the process, and known to imbibe his own home-brewed ale from time to time. Join me?" Edwin nodded. His expressions of doubt about his suitability for the task were apparently bouncing off deaf ears. The cardinal finished injecting the steins to capacity from the cabinet, handed one to Edwin, and said, "Don't be afraid. Follow my instructions, and I'll make you a brewer of men, just like Segundo." Cardinal Marin smiled at his own parodying reference to the first sea mystery and continued, "The entire process for canonization can be torturous, certainly, but I just need you to look into certain areas of Segundo's life and works. You probably did a good portion of that investigation last time you were here." Edwin saw in his mind, instead, the highly abstract sculpture for the first sea mystery, Fishers of Men, he saw displayed in St. Pope Brendan II Church during his month vigil at Chalcedony Colony, 5 jeweled cities to the west around Earth's equator from Sapphire City. Though Segundo had officially named the work, Simon Peter Leaves Its Nets Behind, Edwin recalled Kieran's mention of the artist's private name for the work, Wormbait. He shuddered at the implication, whether the cardinal intended it or not. They both drank a good portion of their Kleinstein's contents in silence. Cardinal Marin could sense Edwin's yet unconvinced discomfort, and continued, "You know, many saints are unrecognized by the Church. Canonization only gives us poor sinners still here in this world good examples to look to and imitate. Even if you were to draw wrong conclusions that ended up preventing his canonization, it wouldn't affect his status before God. He who knows each heart intimately is not so easily thwarted." The cardinal's homily-friendly manner was apparent as he continued, "But rest assured that those damn clergy are thorough, especially in the other direction. Errors or bias that might falsely attribute questionable miracles or behavior to Segundo simply wouldn't be accepted. When it comes to declared holiness, we tend to err on the side of caution. The phrase, 'innocent until proven guilty,' is a foreign concept in canonization. Rather, the fundamental assumption might be purgatorial until proven beatific. To be sure, that approach is often detested by supporters of particular causes for canonization, but so it must be. Still, though the Church is not wanting for variety in regard to saints in its canonization process, I will admit that one more saint associated with the arts, as well as someone having space rock origins, would not be found disagreeable to those of us who care about such things in the outer darkness. Besides, you are already familiar with Segundo's works and methods in life from your research. Your background fits you for that task admirably." Cardinal Marin held up his stein and said, "Toast to the task?" Edwin drew a deep breath. "Okay, I guess," he began. But internally he imagined a boat that he depended upon for livelihood drifting out to sea, forgotten, while he stood on the shore dropping repair needles for his nets onto the sand. "But, the other matter, wouldn't a professional—" Cardinal Marin held up 2 fingers and thumb as though in benediction to interrupt Edwin's question. "First, to your assent," he said, as they clicked steins. After another squeeze of beer, he continued, "It's being looked into already, but it doesn't seem like the police have gotten very far. And private detectives? They tend to have a certain, unsavory character in these parts, I'm afraid. But consider this. I've read your art reviews, including all 12 lengthy installments of your year-long commentary on the art of the outer archdiocese churches. I had a vested interest, you might say. I distinctly remember reading the first line in your preface about the Church's role in transforming the cities from failed engines of space exploration into a veritable gallery row of art colonies in the outer darkness, with enough tourist trade to keep them economically viable. A wry assessment indeed, but true, I thought at the time. In any case, here's my point. I've often found that your reviews reveal curious, insightful, and unexpected connections between wildly disparate works of art, things I'd never noticed before, even about works I was already very familiar with." Edwin nodded and said, "Trust me, Those disparate connections are often as unexpected to me as they are to you when they turn up inside my head. I don't know how it works." "Well, however it happens," Cardinal Marin continued, "it just seems to me that you might be able to use that same insight to uncover connections the police might have missed or thought unconnected, especially given the, disconnected nature of the murder." "You're referring to that recent dismemberment case, right?" said Edwin. "I haven't heard many details about it. Earthcrawler reporting overflows with raw stories and scandalous news about lots of events infesting the outer darkness, so a case like that just gets lost in the morass, I'm afraid." "I did notice a brief mention of your involvement in the discovery, though." "That's the one," replied the Cardinal, "but infesting might be a bit harsh. I know space rocks and earth crawlers engage in a continual us versus them battle of mock denigration. Yes, we have our share of bizarre cases, all the more through the unique aspects afforded by zero gravity for extreme behavior. But we have a good lot up here too, despite my mistrust of the private detectives in this city. I expect earth crawlers fall quite as often as we weightless folk do here. It's just easier to tell which direction they fall in the case of you earth crawlers. The expression a space rock might use is down below the gravity well, ground to dust and closer to hell. Here in the outer darkness, falling doesn't have a recognizable direction. You have to look at things from all angles." The Cardinal's wink came from a face oriented at an obtuse angle to Edwin's position. He took Edwin's Kleinstein in hand with his own and whirled over to the teak cabinet to refill both. Edwin took the refill back and said, "But you don't think I would be somewhat conspicuous looking into that sort of thing? I had the impression from your first Elsint, when you mentioned the Segundo beatification investigation, along with the cryptic hints about this additional police matter, that my coming and reasons for same would be confidential. Was that true? And if not, wouldn't that compromise any advantage I might have? People with something to hide might be less forthcoming." Cardinal Marin raised his eyes from the stein to study Edwin's expression. "Why would you think otherwise?" he asked. "Did Kieran just happen to be on my flight to the outer darkness?" Edwin replied. The Cardinal paused a moment to consider the question and his answer. "Oh, you mean because I contacted her at the sea launch platform to get hold of you? You had apparently Delsint preventing me from contacting you. She comes to the outer darkness quite often, you know. So yes, I knew she was coming on the same flight." Yeah," said Edwin. "She typically comes here to perform with her Cerrone. I mentioned her concerts to her as she passed by me outside Holy Crown a bit ago, just as Mass was starting." "Kieran has composed some stunning works," Cardinal Marin interrupted. "I've seen her perform several of them live up here, and at least a couple were world premieres. She considers our halls in the outer darkness as prime venues, apparently." Edwin continued, "That's true, and oddly enough, when I mentioned that fact to her, she changed the subject pretty quickly." Edwin paused before the strike. "She never lets that instrument out of her sight when she's traveling, you know. It's at least 200 years old, and not another one like it in existence. Her hands were empty when we talked an hour and a half ago. She's not here to play music." Cardinal Marin laughed in the midst of furrowing his brows. "Huh, you see? Who else would have picked up on that? The police? I doubt it. At least not so quickly, I'm sure. And I think you may surprise yourself, Edwin. I know you two are acquainted and friendly, but I know you have sharp differences of opinions at times, too. I wanted you to decide to come on your own accord." Edwin looked away briefly. He thought perhaps the Cardinal knew more than he was letting on, but to avoid going deeper into that subject, he sighed and nodded for the Cardinal to continue. "After you arrived here, I was going to mention at some point that I hoped Kieran might be able to help you to, well, how shall I put it, right straight on the crooked lines that you have to deal with. I know how difficult it must have been for you to return, and I appreciate your acceptance of that difficulty in returning anyway. I've prayed hard for you, and admittedly for the hope of your return and presence here." "Yes, I had gotten that distinct impression back in my garden on earth," Edwin muttered. "As the psalmist says, I am a worm and no man." Cardinal Marin scratched his chin with a puzzled look. "In your garden, eh? I'd like to hear about it," he said, curiosity piqued. "I do remember your analysis of Segundo's shell art sculptures depicting his visions of the Rosary's sea mysteries. I think you wrote in connection with the first mystery that instead of a fisher of men, he saw himself as the lowly worm used as bait by the fishermen. A humble and noble view, though perhaps not much fun for the worm." Is that your feeling being here too? I hope you know how glad I am that you're here now." "I'm so comforted," Edwin said, voice dripping in mock sarcasm and grinning, but then added in perfect seriousness, "But you don't know how close that hits. Yes, I should tell you about the worm in my garden sometime, but later." Cardinal Merrin paused at Edwin's sudden somber mood change, and then continued, "Yes, I do want to hear. But okay, later. Don't forget. Anyway, I do intend these investigations to be confidential. You can trust me on that. Unless you have told someone else that I am unaware of. But I have confided in both you and Kieran on this matter. You might consider Kieran as a sort of intermediary between you and me. I know how often you dulcet when you are struggling in order to focus your thoughts without mental interruptions. She is virtually never dulcet. In fact, I've only known her ever to have dulcet once, and that just recently. It was in connection with her personal frustration when I first contacted her about coming here on this matter. But that issue is past for now. So if she is around during this investigation, she might be able to locate you if I need to contact you quickly and can't get away from Holy Crown. Cardinals do have many matters to attend to, especially here in the outer darkness, it seems. And who knows, in connection with investigation of this murder case, she might even have some insight that you could miss on occasion. Your specialty is in the visual arts after all. She probably has contacts in the music field that could be helpful. This strange case seems to be intimately mixed up in the arts, and, I suspect, even possibly connected with the canonization efforts of this rascal Segundo, whose visions of the Rosary's sea mysteries her new symphonic composition is centered around. So I figured another pair of eyes with equally sharp mind might be helpful in disentangling the situation. I know she can be somewhat, direct, shall we say, at times, but your more, private and introspective manner, if I can put it that way, could benefit from a contrast in approaches. What do you think?" "Well, first, why don't you tell me more about this gruesome discovery you made?" Edwin answered. "All I know from reports back on Earth was encapsulated by that single grim word, dismemberment. Evocative, certainly, but not a terribly detailed description.